Hey everybody, welcome to the channel. I'm glad you could make it because today we are going to be making the OG Breakfast of Champions creamed chipped beef on toast, also known as on a shingle. S.O.S, as it's better known as, was a breakfast dish served in the U.S. military around the turn of the 20th century, and it consisted of three basic elements. You had chipped beef, gravy, and toast. Chipped beef is basically salt-preserved beef that's been sliced very thinly. Think of it like the meat version of Pringles. Gravy was a simple flour roux with stock and milk, and then of course you had your toast. And the earliest recipe that I could find dates back to 1910 out of a U.S. Army cookbook, which is going to be the recipe that we're going to loosely follow here today as we make our version. And it is interesting to note that as the different branches of the armed forces got their hands on cream chip beef over toast, they slowly began to modify it. Different vegetables were added. And somewhere between 1960 and 1970, chipped beef was no longer used and ground meat was added, whether it was pork or beef, whichever one was cheaper. So depending on how old you are and whether or not you served in the U.S. military, you may be familiar with this dish the way that we prepare it today, or you may know it by something completely different. Okay, on to the recipe. Now, one particular ingredient might be a little tricky to find, especially if you want to make this 1910 version of cream chip beef over toast, and that's the chipped beef. Now, we're going to be using our own version of chipped beef, our own preserved beef, if you will. And let me kind of give you a little backstory. About 3.5 years ago, we started a project where we wanted to see how long you could dry age a piece of meat in your refrigerator. Well, we ended up dry aging it for 600 days. If you want to see the video, you can check it out right there. And after tasting it, Cecilia and I put it in a vacuum seal bag and popped it in the refrigerator and literally completely forgot about it until last week. We were cleaning out our fridge and I found these 2 vacuum sealed packs of beef, and they are officially 1,000 days old. So this meat is absolutely well preserved. As you can see, it is hard as a rock, and it's coated in all kinds of beautiful white stuff. Now, you may think that this is mold, but this is actually salt. These are all the natural salts from the meat that make their way to the surface. Let me scrape some of this off, and we're just going to give that a little taste right quick. There we go. See that? Woo! That's like dry-aged salt. It's got this funky, umami, dry-aged flavor. So we've got our beef, and what I think I'm going to do is just clean them up a bit, wash all this exterior salt off of them before we slice them on the slicer, and I got to tell you, I mean, these are well preserved. During the 600-day experiment, they lost something like 75% of their moisture content. And so this is basically like jerky status. As far as the smell goes, wow, that is seriously funky. I mean, that is delivering 1,000-day-old, dry-aged, funky aromas. But it doesn't smell rancid, so let's go ahead and clean this up and make some cream chip beef over toast.
Here's our chipped beef, and the original recipe called for about 15 pounds, which is supposed to feed about 60 people, so we're going to cut that way back. And all we're going to do here is cut this into small pieces to get it ready for the gravy. The meat right now has these amazing dry-aged aromas, and so this will be a very interesting dish. And as far as the texture goes, it's got this leathery style of texture, so not quite like jerky, but drier than your Italian bresaola. So just to give you some idea, and let's go ahead and prepare our gravy. For the gravy, this is going to be a simple roux gravy. We're going to start off with some butter, melt that, give it a stir so the butter doesn't burn, and then we're going to add our flour. Now, when you add flour to make a simple gravy, you do want to make sure that you stir it often. If the flour burns, it's going to impart a bitter flavor. So we're just going to give that a stir and just cook it for about 5 minutes just to cook out that flour flavor. and give it some color. At this point, we are following the 1910 U.S. Army recipe, and we're going to be adding some evaporated milk and some beef stock. If you're going to make this at home, you don't have to add butter. You can add bacon fat or lard for a smoky, porky flavor. You can add milk instead of evaporated milk. You could add regular water. Making a simple gravy is not that complicated. Once you have your roux made, you can add enough liquid until you get it to the thickness that you like. This is about perfect, so we're going to now continue with our black pepper. And then we're going to add our chipped beef pieces. And I'm going to add about half of it in now, give it a stir, and what the recipe calls for is an extraordinary amount of meat. And so I can easily see where this can feed a whole lot of people. So let's go ahead and add the rest of our chipped beef and the rest of our evaporated milk. And this gravy is coming along nicely. And be sure to taste this along the way if you are going to be making this, and simply adjust for seasonings. The beef stock that I'm using is salty enough, so I'm not really having to add any extra seasonings. And this is what our gravy looks like now that it's finished. Smells amazing. Let's go ahead and make our toast.
S.O.S. Cream chip beef over toast, the OG breakfast of champions. Looks and smells amazing. The recipe as it was written was a little thick, and as you saw, we had to add extra stock and evaporated milk to get it to that nice creamy consistency. Very, very beefy. I mean, the amount of meat that this called for can easily feed 15 people, which is what the recipe states it could feed. So let's just go ahead and give it a taste and see what it's like. That's delicious. The gravy is incredibly flavorful, very beefy, and actually took on some of that dry-aged flavor from the meat that we used. The meat I thought was going to be pretty chewy and tough, but actually reconstituted a little bit in the gravy, so it's nice and tender, heavy, heavy dry-aged flavor. So a lot of umami notes, a lot of mushroomy notes, and the toast adds a nice sort of buttery texture to this breakfast. I think probably the main difference between what we're eating here today and what was served back in 1910 is that the chipped beef would have naturally been salty. So they would have either soaked it in some water to, reduce the salty effect of it, or allowed it to be the salt for the dish itself. Overall, very simple dish to make. Matter of fact, you know what? This is so tasty. I'm going to eat another bite here. Very, very delicious. If you can't get your hands on chipped beef or preserved beef and you want to try this recipe, you can always use ground beef or ground pork, add it to the recipe, season accordingly, and it'll be just as good. So you'll find a link to the recipe in the description box below. That's all I got for you today. Thanks for joining us. If you have any questions about this cream chip beef over toast, the OG breakfast of champions, leave them in the comment section below. And if you like this video or got anything out of it, a great big thumbs up is always helpful. If this is the first video that you've seen from our channel, we'd like to say welcome. Click that subscribe button and that notification bell so that you can be notified of our future uploads. We appreciate you being here. Thanks for watching. See you next week. Bye-bye.